We're in 1969. A US Air Force pilot is climbing into a cockpit somewhere in Thailand. His mission is classified. His destination is a country the US is not officially at war with. His plane is loaded with cluster bombs. He will fly this mission, or one like it, roughly 580 times a year. Because somewhere above him, a system is running that measures success in flights, not the results of those flights. He doesn't yet know that 30% of what he drops won't explode. He doesn't know that 50 years from this point, people will still be dying from what he's done. He's just doing his job. He's following orders. And as always, that's the whole problem. To understand why Laos got bombed, you first need to understand what Laos actually was in 1964. Because it wasn't a threat. It wasn't an enemy. It was, by most international agreements, supposed to be completely off limits. A completely neutral country. In 1962, the Geneva Accords formally declared Laos a neutral country. All foreign military forces were supposed to leave. The US signed it, so did the Soviet Union. Basically, everyone signed it. Anyone who was a threat to Laos anyway. Laos is a small, landlocked, largely rural country. A former French colony that only gained independence 9 years before in 1953. It had no real industry, no significant military, no leverage over any of the major powers in the world. But it was trapped by geography. Right down the eastern spine of the country ran what would become one of the most strategically important corridors in the Cold War. The route that North Vietnam used to move troops and supplies south. The Americans would call it the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this is the beginning of the trap that Laos finds itself in. It couldn't stop North Vietnam from using its territory. It didn't have the military capacity to do it. But the US wasn't exactly going to let that corridor just continue to exist when it was a threat to them. So Laos became a battleground for a war it had no part in starting and no ability to stop. The Pathet Lao, a communist movement backed by North Vietnam, was already operating inside the country. So the Lao government was fighting a civil war at the same time it was being used as a superhighway by one superpower and a bombing range by another. There was no good option for Laos. Resist the Americans? They had no leverage. Resist the North Vietnamese? They didn't have the army. Ask the international community for help? The international community had already signed a piece of paper and moved on. So Laos didn't end up in this war because it was a threat. It ends up in this war because it was the opposite. Small enough to use, weak enough to ignore, and legally neutral enough that whatever happened there could be kept quiet. And that's the key thing here. How did the US go on to bomb a country per capita more than it did at any other time in history? And no one really paid attention. It all starts with the name. The name the US government gave it. They called it Operation Barrel Roll, and later Steel Tiger. What they did not call it, at least publicly or officially on the record, was a war, because officially it wasn't one, right? As you've seen in my previous video, the US always attacks people without declaring war. So this is part of the course. The 1962 Geneva Accords meant the US couldn't openly deploy military forces in Laos. So instead, the CIA ran the operation. Air America, a civil airline owned and operated by the CIA, flew missions across the country. US Air Force pilots flew in unmarked aircraft, or were listed as sheep-dipped, temporarily removed from military roles so they appeared to be civilians. The Hmong people of northern Vietnam were recruited and trained by the CIA to fight a proxy ground war. At its peak, this army numbered in the tens of thousands, and they were pretty effective. Good at scouting, good at disrupting supply lines, but they were also the ones bearing all of the costs of the war that they didn't even choose to be part of. The US Congress was largely kept in the dark. Of course, there were no formal declarations of war, no public authorizations, no budget discussions. They funded the whole thing through classified channels. Senators who tried to ask questions hit brick walls. The American public had no idea. And to distract them, the main element of the Vietnam War was on the front pages every day, on the news every night. Laos was happening in the gaps between the headlines. And the important thing here is that the secrecy wasn't just a way of covering up what they were doing, it's what made the escalation possible. If this was all happening in public, it would have faced scrutiny from Congress, journalists, or voters. When it's classified, the only way to stop it is on the inside. And internally, the goal was to keep flying, keep bombing, because they thought that would win the war. Now, to be clear, what we don't have at the moment are any specific promotion structures or reward systems that drove the mission numbers. So there's a gap in what we can say for sure. But the pattern is consistent with how covert operations tend to work. When accountability is removed, people running the program measure success by activity, not outcome. So the secrecy was absolutely critical to this whole operation. Without it, the bombing couldn't have reached the scale it did, because with public scrutiny, someone would have asked whether it was working, just like they did with Vietnam and later Cambodia. And the answer to that question, it turns out, would have been no. It wouldn't have been worth it. Why? Think about the number 2 million for a second. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs on Laos. That is more than was dropped on Germany and Japan combined during the entire Second World War. The equivalent of a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 years. Now we know the official objective was to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. If you could stop supplies moving south, you could strangle the North Vietnamese war effort. That was the United States theory anyway. And look, it's not insane. Trail was real, and the supplies were coming through it. So disrupting it had genuine strategic value, at least on paper. But there's something specific about this route that they're bombing. You can't tell if it's working. And the reason why is because it's mostly jungle. You can count missions. You can count the tons of bombs dropped. You can photograph craters. But what they couldn't measure is whether fewer supplies were actually getting through. And part of that is because the North Vietnamese were very adaptive. They moved at night, they dispersed, they rebuilt, they found new paths. They were more determined to win than the Americans, and it showed. So the metric that ended up being used was the one that could actually be measured. How many missions were flown? And missions cost money, e.g. contracts, fuel, bombs, aircraft. Every mission that flew was a transaction. Someone manufactured those bombs, someone flew that plane, someone signed off the budget. Not just evil, not even irrational. Each individual decision, fly the mission, drop the bombs, file the report, made sense to that person. The pilot had orders, the commander had targets, the contractor had a contract. Nobody in the chain needed to ask whether the whole thing was working because not many in the chain were responsible for that answer. Nobody in the chain needed to ask whether the whole thing was working because not many in the chain were responsible for the answers to that question. And the people underneath all of this, the Laotian farmers, the village families, the Hmong fighters, they had no place in that calculation at all. 2 million tons of bombs dropped on one of the poorest countries in Asia over 9 years by a government that officially denied it was happening. And at every level of the machine, the behaviour was rational. But that's not exactly comforting, is it? It's actually a big problem. But the bombing stopped in 1973. So why are people still dying? Now, an obvious feature of bombs is that they're only useful if they explode, right? And roughly 30% of the bombs dropped on Laos, that's around 80 million individual items, didn't. They just sat there in the soil, in riverbanks, under the rice paddies. The technical term is unexploded bomb, or UXO. The most common type in Laos is the cluster bomb, small, round, sometimes the size of a tennis ball. The Lao people call them bombies. Children find them. Farmers on rice paddies hit them with ploughs. People pick them up because they look like scrap metal, which in a poor rural community has real value. Roughly 50 Laotians are killed or injured by UXO every year. Sure, that number has been declining over time, but at its peak in the years after the war, it was far higher, and it has never reached zero. And by current progress, it will not reach zero for decades, possibly longer. All of us will likely be dead before Laos is free from unexploded bombs that the US dropped in the 1960s and 70s. So that means Laos, one of the least developed countries in Southeast Asia. Farming is the backbone of the rural economy, but the land the farmers need to work is the same land that is riddled with American bombs. You can't grow food on ground you're afraid to dig. You can't build on land you haven't cleared yet. Every decision about where to put a road, where to build a school, where to sink a well, all of it has to account for what might be underneath. And so the financial cost to these rural communities is huge. By the way, this guy was crucial to uncovering that this whole thing was happening, and part of the big reason why it ended. But we're not here to talk about that. I just wanted to quickly acknowledge, even though I don't remember his name off the top of my head, that he was absolutely crucial. The economic cost of this to rural communities is huge, although the available research doesn't give us exact figure for the full impact. What we do know is that contamination holds back farming, limits land use, and pulls resources towards clearance work that could go towards helping people in their day-to-day lives instead. But beyond the financial cost, the human cost. Even if there's roughly 50 people a year are not always dying, they're often losing limbs. Prosthetics are very common in Laos as a result. But at current funding and clearance rates, it will take generations if it ever gets done at all. Now, to be fair, the US has contributed some funding towards clearance effort. Of course, a fraction of what the bombing cost to carry out originally, but hey, they're doing something. And so the war ended in 1973. Bombing stopped, but the bombs didn't go anywhere. They just became someone else's problem. Specifically, the problem of people who were never part of the war, who were children when it ended, and who were now raising children of their own on contaminated land. And here's where the story takes a turn that surprised me. So did it work? Did 9 years of bombing, 2 million tons of bombs, billions of dollars, the most intensive air campaign in history, did it stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail? By 1975, 2 years after the bombing ended, all of Indochina had fallen to communist governments. South Vietnam fell, Cambodia fell, the Pathet Lao took power. They failed with their strategic objective, preventing communist expansion in Southeast Asia. The very effective organisation they call the CIA made their own assessment of the Hmong-led ground operations and described them as highly successful in terms of intelligence and disruption. But overall, the pattern was obvious. The trail kept moving supplies. The Vietnam War kept going, And when it ended the way the US had been trying to prevent with the war in the first place. Now, I'm not saying what the US did didn't matter militarily, that would be too simple. But the specific claim that intensive bombing of Laos would cut off the trail and turn the war, that claim didn't hold up. And the reason for this problem is because it was bigger than any one person. Within the system that was running the bombing, no one really had the real way of asking whether the bombing was achieving its goals. The number of missions were measurable, tonnage was measurable, but the trail's actual throughput wasn't, not accurately anyway. Definitely not in real time. So the system kept optimizing for what it could measure, and the thing it couldn't measure kept on being not measured. This is the core issue. The people who could have asked, is this working, were either not in the chain of command or incentivized to not raise the question. Everything was secret, which meant there weren't many eyes on what was happening. The metrics were activity-based, which meant internal scrutiny was blind. The money kept flowing. Nobody was paying attention to how many Laotians were dying. The bombing of Laos was the largest covert air campaign in history. It ran for 9 years. It dropped more bombs than any campaign before or since on a single country, and it didn't achieve its goal. The system was perfectly designed to keep going and perfectly designed to never have to answer for the results. But that's not the end of it. So Laos was neutral, officially, legally, internationally recognized as neutral. And that neutrality, that status that was supposed to protect it, was precisely what made it vulnerable. A country that's officially at war has some kind of legal status with the other side. It has some rights under international law. It can appeal to the international community. It can make noise. Laos couldn't really make any noise because officially nothing was happening. The bombing was secret. The whole war was secret. Laos couldn't officially complain at the UN, for example, about an operation that didn't officially exist. The Americans could just deny it. And this is the flip of the story that we told at the beginning. The Geneva Accords were supposed to make Laos untouchable. Instead, they made its suffering invisible. And invisible countries don't generate political costs. You can bomb a country like this for 9 years and nobody has to answer for it. Not in Congress, not in the press, not at the UN. And this matters beyond Laos. The logic that operated here, use a weak neutral country as a theatre for war between larger powers, kept it secret so there was no political cost. They measured activity instead of outcomes, so the operation never has to justify itself. That logic didn't end in 1973 when this operation ended. Many of the Hmong fighters who fought for the CIA were abandoned when the war ended. Many fled to refugee camps in Thailand, and tens of thousands of them eventually resettled in the United States. The ones who stayed in Laos faced revenge from the new government. The CIA's proxy army, the people who had really carried all of the load for the secret war, had no claim on the country that recruited them, because officially they'd never been recruited by the USA. And Laos itself, the country that absorbed 2 million tons of bombs, it's still clearing devices 50 years later. Laos received a fraction of what the bombing cost in clearance funding. The difference here is almost perfect. The cost of the operation was paid in Lao lives and Lao land. The benefit, if there was one at all, really went to helping the Americans in their strategic objectives, even though they didn't achieve them. And when people like us start trying to account for these two sides of the equation, we realise they're not even compatible sums. It's weird, isn't it? We started this by talking about the most bombed country in history, and the instinct is to frame that as an atrocity, something that happened because of cruelty or racism or the particular madness of the Vietnam era. And all of that is there. But the more you look at the underlying facts, the more uncomfortable the real answer is. Laos wasn't bombed because anyone hated Laos. Laos was bombed because it was possible to bomb and gave someone a sense of progress in a war they knew they couldn't win already. Because it was so weak, it couldn't fight back. Neutral enough that no one would believe it's really happening. And poor enough that the long-term costs would be felt for decades. This whole thing didn't need cruelty to start and then keep going. It needed invisibility, neutrality, no one to look their way. And once we understand that, once we see how a country can be used up and left behind not because anyone decided to destroy it, although that does happen, here's looking at you, Israel, because no part of the system was ever pointed at the question of what it cost. You start to see that logic everywhere. That's the thing about hidden machinery. It doesn't stop running just because the war ends. Now, the story of Laos is especially bad in the history of US interventions, hence why I focused on it. But did you know there have been over 400 interventions carried out by the USA since it was founded? More than anyone else in that era, and likely in all of history. So why does the USA go to war so often, and with so much of the world? Maybe they just hate everyone? But I think it's deeper than that. Maybe it's Republicans or Democrats. No, that doesn't track either. Watch this so we can piece together the mystery. Why is the USA always at war? Anyway, like and subscribe and all that stuff. Bye bye.